Well, good morning. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today to our annual Scholars Conference and to welcome you in particular to this conference on monumentality. We come together now at the end of nearly a year in which scholars, some for a few weeks, others for the academic year, and some of you just for this conference itself, have been thinking about the questions of monumentality. This center, the Getty Center, now 20 plus years on, speaks of its own monumentality, questions to ask of it today, as all of you who've come together on this occasion, I hope will walk around and think about what this building itself means. What is monumentality? We had a wonderful exhibition for most of the year here at the GRI, and the exhibition was both the monument, as the largest print Piranesi ever made, and to photographs of Napoleon smashed in the streets of Paris. The exhibition was about both the monument and the very question of monumentality in thinking about the freeway system of Los Angeles. The monument gets built and unbuilt, or it stays unbuilt forever, plans strewn across congressional desks when political will fails or changes. The monument serves as the point of protest and the site of support. One cannot imagine, or maybe you can, London without Trafalgar and Nelson, or New York without the Statue of Liberty. And here, I suspect some of you immediately conjure up the original Planet of the Apes. But these are monuments of the conservative and usually of the triumphal. And there is monumentality, the very question of the order of magnitude with respect to the ordinary iteration of the thing. What does it mean, I ask myself, when the standard version of the Maya stele that you see here, typically slightly larger than life, doubles or triples in size and scale, thus abandoning the proportionality it holds with respect to the human form? Is it monument or monumentality? And wherever it is, whenever it is, the monument provokes action and reaction in ways that often threaten its existence. We also seek invisible monumentality. We seek the monumentality from space, the monumentality embedded, say, in the Nazca lines of South America, meant only to be known and understood from the ground, mapping themselves into the brain. The monumentality that neuroscience tells us our brain can compute and understand even when it cannot truly be seen. The monumentality that in turn equally implies the miniature. We ask these questions about the monument and monumentality today across diverse times and spaces and places, seeking to learn from one another without the expectation of commonalities or some great truth we can share at the end. In my experience, such search usually ends up telling us that we can all learn from the West. But we'll learn, notwithstanding. My thanks in particular today go to the Scholar Year and all the amazing work that has been done, all the remarkable talks that I have heard over the course of the year, and that give me great expectation about the next 2 days. At the GRI, I want particularly to thank Andrew Perchuk, Deputy Director, who had so much work to supervise when my predecessor, Tomas Gatkins, retired about a year ago. And to Alexa Sekyra, who is in charge of our Scholars Program and who will tell you a little bit more about her staff in just a few minutes. And I want very much to thank the museum, which has opened its doors to us today, and to the center, which continues to support the very concept of research at its heart. Welcome all, and Alexa, please.
Good morning. I'm Alexa Sekyra, head of the Scholars Program, and I would like to welcome you warmly to this symposium on monumentality. First, I would like to thank Mary for her warm welcome and her generous support of the program. And this is the first Getty Scholar Year Symposium under her tenure as the director of the GRI, and it is an honor and a pleasure to work with Mary. Thank you. I also would like to thank the GRI staff who have been so integral in welcoming and accommodating our scholars, our fellows, and our speakers for this conference. And I would like to do that now by name. Instrumental for also putting together this conference was Edward Sterrett. Then Sisbe Gensler helped, Sharon Kim, Rebecca Mann, and Sabine Schlosser, all team members of the Scholars Program. Then at the events department, it was Sue Kang, Aaron Lee Harvey, and at AV, those colleagues you hardly ever see because they're very much behind the scene. It is Gus Kowaleski, Andrea Vancura, Ronald Bunny, and John Keefe, who is actually videotaping the whole conference. I also would like to mention again, as Mary did before, our colleagues Maristella Casciato and Frank Turpak, who curated the Monumentality exhibition, and they were very generous with their time and expertise and shared on a wonderful level with all of our scholars who had many interesting questions for them. Over the course of the Scholar Year, we have had many fascinating presentations by the scholars who were here already in fall and through the winter term, and they addressed the theme of monumentality through a very wide range of perspectives. And those different topics actually have set the groundwork for our explorations today. And now I would like just to run through very, very briefly their presentations again as a reminder, but also for those who have not been here to hear those presentations, to actually really see the wide array that we already covered. And with the conference in the next 2 days, we're actually rounding out what we already addressed from so many different angles and so many different perspectives. And we started, that's our poster here, and we started with our colleague Renee Atta, and she addressed Monumentalizing Suffering and Death, Commemoration of the Slave Past in the Urban Landscape of Alexandria, Virginia. Then we had Michalis Olympios, A Tomb for All Seasons. He was one of our Connecting Art History scholars. Then we had Mara Wade, Public Monuments in the Free Imperial City in Nuremberg. Then we had Henna von Hesburg, Architectural Models from the 6th century BCE. We continued with Nicolas Drossos, Monumental Decorative Art under the state socialism. We had Hal Foster talking with Richard Serra. We had Mons Larsen, the narrative in Neo-Assyrian art. We had Stanislaus von Moos, the monumentality of the matchbox. Wait a minute, yeah. Then we had Savino di Lernia, Monumentality in Prehistoric Sahara. We had Morgan Ing, The Renaissance Superstructure. We had Avinoam Shalem, When Nature Becomes Ideology, Lifter Silence. Celia Gica, Footnotes on the Pedestal. Cristobal Chacón Moreno, Diego Rivera in El Pedregral. Then we had Reino Ishto, Support Groups, or Is There Weak Monumentality, or is it a useful category? Then we had a talk by Kavita Singh, Indian Monuments in and Out of the Victoria and Albert Museum. And then we had Niklas Kwiatkowski, The Symbolic History of Elephants in the Early Modern World. After the conference, there are 4 more talks, and I'm also going to mention them very briefly. Elisabeth Kassler-Taub is going to talk about monumentality and absence in early modern Palermo. Then Samuel Omans about painting and geometry in El Lissitzky architecture. Then we have Edward Dimmenberg, Anton Wagner and the Invention of Los Angeles as Object and Geographical Knowledge. And the last speaker this year then will be Darby English. What about minor monumentality? So I would like to thank everybody who came and will participate in the conference, but I also would like to mention very, very briefly, we had one presenter and scholar who got very sick and cannot participate, and I was myself at the conference 10 days ago in Rhode Island and actually heard Nancy Steinhardt moderating a panel there, and all her work was on monumentality of Chinese architecture. And I approached her after her session, and I met or actually talked to Nancy many years ago before in a different context, and I said, Nancy, would you be willing to actually come and join our conference, which is going to take place in a week? And Nancy looked at me, I think, a little bit puzzled and probably thought something is not quite right with that lady. And she then said, let me think about it, because I do know, and Nancy really worked on monumentality after the last many, many years. And she said, I'm going to drive now from Providence back to Philadelphia, and that drive is going to take me about 5 hours. I'll call you afterwards. And she did. And she said, I'm in. So I just would like to mention that we have a very last-minute edition. Nancy is in the program. But that was a very wonderful, I wouldn't call it event, but wonderful meeting, and I'm sure we're going to learn a lot, not just from the whole group, but also about monumentality in Chinese architecture. So now I'm going to hand it over to our moderator for the first session. And I also would like to mention, we asked our pre- and postdocs to be moderators for the whole symposium, which is a slightly different new format. And since it's their topic, their theme, I think they all will do a fantastic job in moderating and rounding it out beautifully. So thank you, and welcome to Morgan Ng, our moderator for the first session.
So good morning. It's great to be here. I think it's really cool that we get to kick off the conference with not an art historian, but a philosopher. So our first speaker is Dieter Thomä, who is professor of philosophy at the University of St. Gallen. He's currently also a member of the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. He's the recipient of numerous accolades, including a fellowship at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. He's taught at UC Davis and Brown, but he's no stranger to the study of artistic culture and aesthetics, having written on the Gesamtkunstwerk in Wagner and Eisenstein, on issues such as narrative and even on happiness, a subject that we've been able to experience here at the Getty. He's also no stranger to the GRI, having been a fellow here in 2002 and 2003. He's also the author of no fewer than 10 monographs. His latest book, which I've been enjoying, is a kind of political philosophy turned adventure novel. And I learned that its English translation has just come out as Troublemakers, a philosophy of puer robustus. So please welcome Dieter.
Thank you so much. Well, I have so many fond memories of this place. I This was frankly the best time I've ever had at an academic institution, so I'm glad to be back. I'm not so sure whether it's cool that you start with the philosopher, because it may well be a rather clumsy, simple-minded attempt from my side to approach the topic of monumentality. And I will do so by going back and forth between aesthetic and political or historical observations, and will use a particular case study, as it were, as a red thread guiding through my talk. But let me, as I said, given that I'm a simple-minded philosopher, let me start with very simple observations on the very nature of monumentality. And I think what comes to mind here are two things, namely, first, a certain feature that has to do with spatiality, and secondly, a certain feature that has to do with temporality. So as you see, this is really philosophical now. What do I mean by that? When it comes to spatiality, we obviously have to face the fact that they are big. Most of them are big. And when it comes to temporality, we can observe that they don't move. So like this monument from the Plaza of Heroes in Vienna, showing Prince Eugene, how do you pronounce that in English? Prince Eugen. It's big and it's not moving. So this simple observation can be spelled out in the following manner. Monuments represent something. The topic of representation plays a major role in my work in general and also in this talk. So they represent something from the past, an event or a person, and they make it last. So the fact that they don't move has to do with a certain ahistoricity, or something that remains, stays the same over time. This very feature has to do with the fact that by representing something, you overcome the present, which would then, pass by, become the past, and would be replaced by a different present. So the basic function of monuments, as you know, etymologically speaking, has to do with admonishing you of something that is important, that plays a constitutive role in a community. You are reminded of something, and the monument helps you do so. This is the particular historical function of monuments, traditionally speaking, and the particular historical function of this mode of representation. But there's a second aspect to this idea of representation that doesn't allude to the temporal aspect, being something that comes after the present, but it has to do with the aesthetic aspect of representation. So a remodeling, a reimagining of something that when you see it, hints at something or refers to something that is not here anymore. So there is a reimagining going on, and that is obviously the aesthetic side to the story. So you don't see the true prince here, you see somebody else, you see something carved in stone or made of metal. This atemporality has a major downside, namely it's boring. So what happens to monuments is that they tend to make up for that, this inconspicuousness by becoming big. So one simple explanation for the sheer size of monuments is they want to be still seen, even though, given the fact that they don't change, that they are just there, day in, day out, even though this fact makes them be overlooked all too often. So they are not they don't have any performative quality, you could put it that way as well. And that's what Robert Musil, in a famous text that probably most of you know, and that has been has got a major reception internationally, has remarked when he said, and I only quote part of the quote that you see on the right, "Monuments are so conspicuously inconspicuous. They are, further down, impregnated with something that repels attention." And again, further down, "Many people have the same experience, even with larger-than-life-sized statues. Every day you have to walk around them or use their pedestal as a haven of rest, but you never look at them." So these are these general observations on spatiality and temporality of monuments. And now let me turn to a particularly intriguing case that problematizes both temporality and spatiality in a particular manner, and they problematize temporality. Temporality or historicity is the major problem here. Why is that? Because monuments tend to be bound to the past. So you think of something that is gone. And this is something that isn't really to the liking of people who emphasize the present, whose identity very much relies on what they are doing now. So what does that mean? That monuments have hard times when people start a revolution. So how do you deal with monuments? And this is how I get to the point of combining aesthetic and political aspects. How do you deal with monuments when you start a revolution? Well, one of the most famous examples you see here, it's une figure colossale, which was erected in 1793, designed by Jacques-Louis David, on the Place des Invalides in Paris, at the occasion of the festival celebrating the unity of the people and the indivisibility of the nation. So what is interesting about this monument is the fact that it doesn't admonish you of something that is gone. So the stability it creates is a stability not serving the purpose of reminding you of Prince Eugene or somebody else, but the stability is actually is downplayed. So the monument is of plaster. The monument will be destroyed afterwards. It's for this very occasion. And it doesn't show, so what does it show? It shows Hercules, obviously, but Hercules is not meant to be some kind of a role model or the ideal that the French people should imitate or emulate, but rather it's the other way around. So this figure, as you will see, is a figure representing the present, representing the very present of this people, of the powerful revolutionary move of this people. It's, by the way, 60 feet high, and the pedestal is also 60 feet, so the sheer size is again back in the picture. And at this occasion in August 1793, the president of the National Convention, Marie-Jean Hérault de Seychelles, later killed by the Jacobins, gave a speech on the Place d'Invalides, and here you have it, an extract of it, and what I find most intriguing and what kind of illustrates the point I want to make is this thing here, Peuple français, le géant, c'est toi. So 2 remarks on that. First, it's obviously an allusion to l'état c'est moi, or an inversion of that. So the giant is the people. It's not the emperor anymore who is in charge, but more importantly, you have a turning of the tables. So the giant does not represent historical greatness, you know. It's rather meant to be, the giant is meant to be representing a present greatness, so the present the greatest of the present people. The giant serves as a mirror. The people should look up to the giant, but not in order to feel humiliated or in order to feel the urge to kind of live up to something that is almost out of reach, but it's rather meant to be this giant to be reflecting or making the people aware of the fact that they are already big. And so it's really a mirror image rather than a role model that they see here. And what is more important even is the fact that there is no, that this phrase, even though the monument shows Hercules, this phrase is actually turning the monument against its historical longevity, right? I mean, it's really not admonishing, meant to be an admonition of the past, but an admonition of the self, or the admonition of the people oneself. Be now. This is how you could sum it up. Now, does that work? So one of the questions I'm interested in is, does this kind of shrinking of the temporal perspective when it comes to representing the present really work? And you may doubt that. So you may doubt that because, for instance, in 1789 and many other documents, you obviously don't have the very same pattern of representing the present and getting rid of the past, but you have this other element that is already in play when you see Hercules in 1793, namely that there is some kind of productive relation or some kind of inspiration drawn from the past and, for instance, from Hercules, again, who obviously, as you know, played even more so than Marianne a major role in the iconography of the French Revolution. L'auriez-vous cru que ce peuple qui chante et qui rit avait le courage d'Hercule, and the other guy. So they do use the past as an energy boost, as it were, and what they do then is that for instance, Hercules becomes and remains an important reference point, and as you see, you now start to get involved in a long kind of winding history of how you use a monumental figure from the past, and you will see that this monumental figure is not just kind of a simple ideal that you imitate that plays a major role in the history of monumentality, but it's also a figure that is adapted and changed and used for various purposes. So I go through that very quickly. You see here that the iconography of Hercules with his bat comes back in various variations over and over again during the revolution, after the and also in this famous, probably most intriguing monument that was not realized, but you only have the sketch. So I could talk about that half an hour. I won't do that because there's also Saturn in the picture, not just Hercules. Very interesting. So the people eating the king, a monument again symbolizing the strength of the people, and which was supposed to be erected at the border of France, at various spots at the border of France. But I skipped that story. So what you have is a rivalry between the urge of a political body to be present and the resources people use for kind of emphasizing this very power of the people. And in order to emphasize the power, you may take refuge to using some kind of monumental repertory if you want to. But this using of past elements always runs the risk of distracting from what's actually going on in the present. And this is why you have a critique of representation in revolutionary times. And the most famous representative of this critique is obviously Rousseau with his phrase, "The will does not admit of being represented." So what you have is a critique of representation in political terms, and also famously a critique of representation in aesthetic terms, because Rousseau is not just criticizing representative democracy, he's also criticizing the arts for representing and distracting people, citizens, from their own task, which is mainly agency, or being agents and not, or actors, and not being passive observers. The famous phrase from his letter to D'Alembert is that they should have their own spectacles, and that in these spectacles they represent themselves. So what happens is here, and this is the very intriguing meaning of this rien, or this nothing, what happens here is that that the difference between you being present as an actor and you representing yourself or playing a role gets minimized. So you are basically an emancipatory actor, you are liberating yourself, and you do all kinds of things. So you create your own festival or spectacle, as Rousseau says. But what happens then in the next step is that you shouldn't kind of get lost in this representation, but you should maintain your agency. And that's why you basically show nothing different. That's the meaning of this rien. You show nothing different from what you are. So there's no role play, there's pure performance, pure performativity, and I think performance studies and the notion of performativity in political theory, which is a rather hot topic recently, can be traced back to Rousseau easily. And so this is the strain criticizing representation, which also can be illustrated by going back to Saint-Just and by Tocqueville. Maybe I skip just Saint-Just, who wanted to create this distance between any kind of role model and the actual revolutionary practice, which doesn't have any model. And I just hint at this phrase from Tocqueville, who basically made the critical point that revolution tried to cut history in halves, so abolishing any possibility of representation, historicity, and so on and so forth, but that this actually wasn't really working properly, that it was an overly confident move, destroying the whole potential of dealing with history in a creative manner. I skip that and now come to this other strain. So you have this one strain, basically getting rid of monumentality, getting rid of representation linked to monumentality, and legitimizing only one kind of monumentality, which basically comes down to this equation of you are present and you represent your own presence, and this is kind of all you can do without getting distracted from your purpose, right? So this is one strain in revolutionary politics, and the other strain is a more kind of affirmative use of monumentality and representation. I alluded to that earlier, and here you have basically the idea of dealing with the material from the past in a creative manner, and you see examples for this in the 19th century, and I limit my observations to the figure of Hercules that you've already met. So here's Daumier, various caricatures from Daumier, one from his most ambitious task of tearing down old school monumentality, l'histoire ancienne, the very famous series of caricatures. So here you have a right-wing minister from who is kind of a Hercules, somehow undernourished Hercules. Here you have the Hercules having to deal with the aftermath of Napoleon III, and here again the similar image, somebody who has to deal with the dirty laundry of the empire. That's what it says here, linge sale de l'Empire. Okay, so you see that Hercules becomes a kind of a source for various messages. And this already leads to a kind of more, I would say, liberal or more self-confident dealing with the material that you have from the past. How many minutes do I have? 14. Oh, okay. So I can actually cover this. I thought I had less time, but so you will have more time for discussion, which is fine. I can actually talk a little about this particular way of taking up the loaded history of Hercules, and this is Charles Baudelaire's famous essay on Le Peintre de la Vie Moderne, published in Le Figaro in 1863 for the first time. And what you have here is one of the most intriguing sentences from this essay, and this is voilà peut-être un homme riche, mais plus certainement un Hercule sans emploi. And I may quote a little more extensively. Here we surely have that ease of bearing, that simplicity in the habit of command, that calmness revealing strength in every circumstance, that convince us when our eye does pick out one of those privileged beings, there goes a rich man perhaps, but quite certainly an unemployed Hercules. The specific beauty of the dandy, obviously he talks about the dandy and the painter, in this text consists particularly in that cold exterior resulting from the unshakable determination to remain unmoved. One is reminded of a latent fire whose existence is merely suspected, and which, if it wanted to, but it does not, could burst forth in all its brightness. So you obviously have Baudelaire here after 1848, after he participated in the revolutions in February and June. Stories are that his hands smelled of gunpowder, smelled of gunpowder back then, and that he was totally enthusiastic about the whole thing and wanted to shoot his father-in-law and so on and so forth. But this was, and so you have a story of disappointment here. A story of disillusion maybe, but famously there is a research on Baudelaire not just becoming this la pour la poet who many think he was after 48, but his late texts maintain a certain political, or preserve a certain political agenda. And here you see two things. First, there's this reference to Hercules, and obviously everybody thinks of the French Revolution when he reads Hercules in France, even in 1860-something. So there is an immobilization of this figure. So it's actually a mode of disappointment, a mode of disillusion, that's for sure. And so there's a certain inferiority as well. And that would then mean, okay, I see the monument, let's say by Jacques-Louis David, and I feel my weakness, or I feel inferior. And this would be the old hierarchy, larger-than-life monuments, and us being reminded of past greatness and desperately trying to live up to that greatness, or feeling like a loser because you kind of forget about that. So this is the one side. So the repertoire is limited in the sense that you feel, okay, this is our reference point, Hercules, and the thing is, I'm not. I don't have any, how is it in English, employment, any performative perspective. I can't perform. I'm kind of retired, unemployed. So this is one thing. And the other, this is basically a story, a melancholy story. And then there's this other thing that obviously Baudelaire isn't one of these nostalgic romantics, but belongs to a different period, and that he then tries obviously to come up with a however reluctant redescription of heroism, because heroism plays a major role in this text as well. So the dandy as a new hero, as an and other people as new heroes. So there are these famous poems where he actually goes back and forth between melancholy on the one hand, and some kind of even violent outbreak on the other hand. So there is this redescription of agency that may kind of be concealed in this figure of the dandy, because there is this fire that could burst forth in all its brightness, but it doesn't. But it could. So you see how there's a very kind of appealing, in all its ambivalence, very appealing approach to monumental figures, and a very appealing approach to adopting or reimagining, transforming the very meaning of these monumental figures, also the very meaning of what it means to be somebody like Hercules today. Is it the revolutionary class? Is it the beggar, one of Baudelaire's intriguing figures? Is it the worker? So you can obviously redistribute the roles in a historically meaningful manner. So this brings me to my last example, namely this monumental picture by John Fate, the Scottish painter, George Washington taking the salute at Trenton, Trenton being near to Princeton, where I am at the moment. So here, this is obviously old school monumentality, 100 years after the fact, reminding everybody who is said to live in a post-heroic age. The post-heroic age was already a pattern in the 19th century in the US. And the people living in this post-heroic age are supposed to be reminded of the great deeds of the past, of the great men of the past, and this picture serves the purpose of creating admiration. And then you have the choice of feeling inferior, as I mentioned earlier, or of feeling encouraged to live up to the founding fathers and to re-strengthen this ambition. Now, I chose this monumental picture for the reason that there is an interesting variation to that, and this is this one. Titus Kaffar, the New Haven-based artist, Shadows of Liberty from 2016, which I fortunately discovered in the Yale Museum of Art a couple of weeks ago. So what happens here, it's an adaptation of the earlier painting. It's obviously altered. So the yellow stuff you see in front are cut pages from the journals or the official economic household books, I don't know how you call them, from Washington himself, cut and obviously showing information on the slaves he had on his property. So it's basically showing his property, and you can, if you look closely, actually read the certain names on these stripes. And what does it mean? It means that this monumentality is rewritten, that the representative meaning of this particular monumental picture is altered. Interestingly, though, Kaffar doesn't choose the way that, for instance, Saint-Just chose. Heroism doesn't have any models. So he doesn't come up with a new hero or whatever. His whole work, obviously, is deeply entrenched in the past, and he feels if we want to liberate ourselves, we have to go back to the monuments, but deal with them in a different manner. So heroism does have models, but maybe the wrong models, or maybe models that need to be reappraised or reinterpreted, and also may be criticized. So we are not bound by a legacy, but we still have to deal with the legacy. And there's an interesting comment by Kafar himself on this very problem. And that brings together the two key terms that I used in my talk, namely representation and monuments. That's the nature of representation. Every time we represent something, we alter it and slightly change it. That already applies to affirmative larger-than-life monuments from the old times. Right now, my project is to go around the country, that's what he actually does currently, and scan these national monuments and try to make these amendments, not to remove those monuments, not to take them down, but in the same way as we do to the Constitution, when we change the laws, we add an amendment. Here you have the aesthetic and the political back in play again, the amendment to the famous amendments to the Constitution in the US, and the artistic amendment to, for instance, this monumental picture of Washington's. So it's representation doesn't have an immobilizing effect anymore in the sense of, well, they don't move, like when I, at the beginning, talked about Prince Eugene, but it has a liberating potential. So this is kind of, so you may say that you stress the re in representation, the kind of mobilizing option that you have when you talk about representation. And it obviously also makes a very interesting suggestion, when you read this quote from Kafar, to a pressing topic that we have at the moment in the US, namely how to deal with the Confederate monuments. Tear them down, alter them, and his intriguing suggestion is, no, let's not tear them down. Let's not rename everything, let's not abolish everything, but use it as something that belongs to our past, but is not kind of binding us. So this, I think, makes clear that representation may have both aesthetically and politically actually an emancipatory or liberating effect. So, thank you.
Thanks, Dieter, for a wonderful talk. Our next speaker is Marisa Ann Bass, who is Associate Professor of Art History at Yale. She's a specialist of early modern art and intellectual culture in Northern Europe. Like Dieter, she's been a member of the IAS at Princeton, and she's also held fellowships from Leiden University and CASVA. Her monograph on Jan Gossert was published by Princeton University Press in 2016, and with breakneck speed, she's just published another book on Joris Höfnagel, which is a really, really gorgeous book and beautifully written as well. And it seems like she works on art at various scales, because whereas the book on Höfnagel is on a miniaturist, she also has a current book project provisionally entitled The Shadow of the Monument in the Modern Republic. And some of this we hope to hear today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Morgan, for that kind introduction. And I want to thank Mary and Alexa and everyone here at the Getty for the invitation to speak at this wonderful conference, and to all of you for being here. I will pick up on some of the themes, particularly the question of the performance of monuments that Dieter already wonderfully addressed. Larger than life, greater than he ever was, the Dutch admiral, Michiel de Ruyter, succumbs to death in a rather uncomfortable position. He rests on a bed of crumpled sail that was once full with wind, his head propped on a cannon that once unleashed so much fire upon his enemies. His right hand still grasps his baton in rigor mortis, the index finger outstretched as if suspended in the giving forth of one final command. Twisted in a recumbent contrapposto that defies the rigidity and constriction of his armor, de Ruyter's body heaves not with breath, but with the ebb and flow of the implied waters beneath him. The two Tritons on either side now bear him across the seas that he so often navigated, their muscular arms and torsos embodying the strength that he so often displayed while still alive. The Triton's cheeks burst with the air that will no longer fill de Ruyter's lungs as the drone of their conches melds with the cries of the putti and the trumpeting of fame in the tableau above them. A heavy garland comprised of oceanic spoils, an entanglement of shells, pearls, crustaceans, and the admiral's own discarded gauntlets hangs from the Triton's shoulders and serves to frame the base of a relief that depicts de Ruyter's final and fatal battle off the coast of Sicily. Yet that scene of the admiral's last stand against the distant backdrop of Mount Etna's molten flames is eclipsed by the far grander one that unfolds before us in the moment. The scene of his body buoyed triumphant upon the waves and washing ceaselessly upon the shore of the present. De Ruyter's monument, created by the Flemish sculptor Rombout Verhulst and completed in 1681, was something of an inevitability. It was part of a tradition that began more than 70 years earlier, the tradition of tombs honoring the admirals of the Dutch Republic who lost their lives in the service of their country. These commissions were the impetus of the Dutch governing body known as the States General, but their creation was also overseen and financed, both by the local branches of the Admiralty in the various towns where they were erected, and by the widows and descendants of the admirals themselves. Over the course of the 17th century, these tombs grew in scale and ambition, deriving strength from the lineage of those that came before and from the competitive investments of their governmental, local, and familial patrons. Michiel de Ruyter was the last major figure in this cult of naval celebrity, and his tomb not only the last in the series, but also its culmination. Upon de Ruyter's death in 1676, even before Verhulst was contracted for the project, the Republic's poets and orators were voicing impassioned calls for a monument worthy of the admiral who already in his lifetime had emerged as the nation's most acclaimed maritime hero, and who remains to this day the star of Dutch children's books and the big screen blockbuster. This says in Dutch, "The English are coming." A 2004 national poll to determine de grootste Nederlander, or the greatest Dutch person of all time, ranked Michiel de Ruyter number 7, ahead of both Anne Frank and Rembrandt van Rijn. Yet despite de Ruyter's fame, his monument remains a blind spot, neglected even in the scant scholarship on 17th century Dutch sculpture. When discussed at all, it has primarily been in relation to the admiral tombs that came before it. The standard party line is that de Ruyter's tomb and its precursors were collectively meant as embodiments of republican virtue. Because the admirals came from mostly humble origins, because they had risen by virtue of their deeds rather than by noble rank, their achievements, so the argument goes, mirrored the ideology of a citizen republic that had freed itself from the yoke of Spanish imperial rule to claim an independent political identity. By this account, the monuments in the Admirals' honor were not just sites for the commemoration of individual heroes, they also carved out a space for reflection on the Dutch fight for liberty from sovereign power, affirming the foundational narrative of what was the first modern Republican nation. While this interpretation reflects the official rhetoric and hagiography that surrounded the admiral tombs already in the 17th century, it hardly accounts for the complex diversity of motivations and circumstance that led to the tombs in question. Much like the Confederate monuments of recent controversy here in the United States, some of the admiral monuments were designed according to a standard mold, but others, de Ruyter's included, were unique commissions that reflect specific local agendas as much as they espouse broad national claims. In the latter half of the 17th century, during the period when most of the Dutch provinces rejected governance by the noble members of the House of Orange, certain admiral tombs increasingly figured their protagonists less as citizen heroes than as substitute noblemen, if not as stand-ins for the stadtholder or ruler himself. This strategy of ennoblement by association, achieved through heightened scale and emphasis on coats of arms and armorial trappings, was in many cases more motivated by the personal ambitions of the admiral's descendants than by the presence of any coherent or state-sanctioned program to ensure political continuity. It was also a strategy that was anything but purely Republican in spirit. Indeed, far from presenting a clear notion of Republican virtue, the admiral tombs instead remind us that the Dutch Republic was always an appealing idea, but never a stable entity in the 17th century, as ambitions and failures abroad, as well as discord and violence at home, threatened its still nascent self-image. Each major monument in the sequence of the Dutch admiral tombs speaks to a distinct historical moment in the Republic's persistent struggle to define itself. As we will see, de Ruyter's monument belongs to a moment when a concern to maintain the Dutch empire of global trade and colonial possessions abroad was equal, if not stronger, than the concern for Republican principles. I will return to that point and to the interrelation of classical form and imperial ambition in my conclusion. But within the context of this symposium and its focus on monumentality across time and place, de Ruyter's tomb offers a little-known example through which to explore a broader problem in the interpretation of monumental production. What is more significant in assessing a given monument, its intention or its effect? The legacy of Alwa Riegel's famous definition of monuments according to their intentionality set a precedent for art historians to approach the genre foremost as an ideological one. Riegel was concerned, in the context of his 1903 essay, with the question of historical preservation and with how to assign historical value to the monumental structures of the past, even when the original intentions behind them had long been forgotten. Monuments, it is true, are not very good at keeping viewers on point and rarely age well, even if, as Dieter already said, they are ostensibly meant to make things last. But my interest lies not in problematizing their temporality or permanence. Instead, I want to consider their rhetoric of monumentality on its own terms. By this, I do not mean the intentionality of the monument, but rather the way the monument sets about achieving its intentional aims. Considering this performative aspect of monuments as reflected in their design, materiality, and location allows for the recuperation of their place within the history of art and within the history of works designed not just to be seen, but still more to be experienced. As I hope to show, de Ruyter's funerary monument and its performance of monumentality betrays an uncertainty about the efficacy of monuments as vehicles of nation building, even if Republican ideals were central to the intentionality behind its creation. It is a monument that in many respects gives the lie to the promise of the admiral tombs as a genre, and might be said to mark the death of the very tradition to which it belongs. Now, as with any tomb, the story of this monument begins with a corpse. When de Ruyter's body returned to the Low Countries from the shores of Sicily, it first landed in the harbor of Rotterdam. There, the local admiralty made a bid for burying the hero in the city's Grote Kerk. 2 other admirals, shown here, had already garnered tombs in the transept of the Rotterdam church. And a life-size bronze statue of the great Netherlandish scholar Desiderius Erasmus stood just outside its doors, the only freestanding public monument to an individual ever erected in the 17th century Netherlands. Its sculptor, Hendrik de Keyser, understood better than most that monumentality was a risky business in the Dutch context, and especially in the Republic's early years. He portrays Erasmus with little grandeur and in motion, so absorbed in his reading that he seems about to fall off his pedestal and flat on his face. Rotterdam, however, was not destined to be de Ruyter's final place of rest, as it was Amsterdam that ultimately won out in the competition for the tomb. An initial attempt was made to secure the choir of Amsterdam's Oude Kerk as the Admiral's burial site, a location that would have placed him within a particular monumental lineage. The first funerary monument to a Dutch admiral had hung in the Oude Kerk since 1609, de Keyser's humble and text-heavy epitaph to Jacob van Heemskerk, who died fighting the Spanish in the Battle of Gibraltar during the 80 Years' War. The Heemskerk monument also exerted an enduring influence in the Oude Kerk itself, inspiring a series of subsequent epitaphs within the interior, all dedicated to other admirals and captains. This was fitting in the church that was Amsterdam's favored site of worship for sailors, proximate to the harbor and regularly used by seamen to repair their nets and sails. But again, in de Ruyter's case, this was not meant to be. The choir of the Oude Kerk was already occupied by other graves that the families of the deceased would not have moved, and an alternate site, again, had to be found. The next best option allowed for the creation of a monument on a scale that the Oude Kerk could never have supported, the choir of the Nieuwe Kerk, or New Church in Amsterdam, the church on Dam Square that brushed shoulders with the city's imposing town hall built 2 decades earlier. Like the Oude Kerk, the Nieuwe Kerk was a former Catholic institution that had been whitewashed and converted to the Dutch Reformed denomination following the iconoclasm that swept the Netherlands in the second half of the 16th century. Yet compared to the older church, the Nieuwe Kerk's higher ceilings and larger choir allowed for a tomb more monumental both in size and rhetoric. Indeed, the artist Emmanuel de Witte emphasized the capaciousness of its setting to full effect in this contemporary painting, commissioned by the Admiral's ambitious son, Engel de Ruyter. De Witte shrouds the tomb in shadow, placing ostensible emphasis on the crowd of visitors come to admire the monument, but the symmetry and vanishing lines of the composition leave no doubt as to where the emphasis lies. It would not be an exaggeration to say that de Ruyter's tomb, unlike the subdued epitaph to Heemskerk, performs a hostile takeover of the Nieuwe Kerk's former main altar and still gated choir, that it capitalizes on the residue of Catholic veneration to demand veneration of a different kind. The imposing sculptural facade is unique within the history of Dutch funerary sculpture in taking the form of a triptych. Much like the Protestant text paintings that began to occupy Dutch churches in the wake of iconoclasm, this monument in its form at once replaces and effaces the traditional Catholic devotional image. The white Carrara marble that constitutes the tomb's primary material echoes the whitewashed walls of the converted Protestant interior, and its subdued classical pediment and columns respond to the thick pillars and clerestory of the late Gothic structure that rises above them. We should not understand this effect as one of secularization, but instead as the appropriation of sacrality to further the monument's own aims. Just as significant as the effect achieved within the Nieuwe Kerk's interior was the dialogue between de Ruyter's monument and the town hall outside the church's doors. Verhulst was one of the sculptors involved in the building that was designed by the eminent architect Jacob van Campen and inaugurated in 1655. It was an architectural monument not just for Amsterdam, but one meant to embody the Republic at large, and the most monumental building erected in the Netherlands during the century, full stop. Here in the marble floor of the Citizens' Hall, cartographic and cosmological maps figure the Dutch Republic as the center of the entire world. And from its ground plan to its inner doorways and arcades, the town hall proclaimed the embrace of classical form and grand scale in the Low Countries, a region that had long favored its own Renaissance Gothic and indigenous architectural language. It hardly takes much scrutiny to observe the way that Verhulst's design of De Ruyter's tomb picks up on the town hall's interior color palette of red, white, and black stone, or the way that the personifications of prudence and watchfulness in the two side wings of its triptych echo the personifications of that adorn the town hall's shallow recesses within its walls and are freestanding atop its exterior. And you can see one of the interior figures up there. Most of all, however, the garland draped between the tritons flanking De Ruyter's body echoes the town hall's most recurrent motif, the varied and virtuosic garlands weighted down by the harvests of earth and sea that appear not only on the town hall's exterior, but also line its inside walls. Manifesting the abundance of the Republic's overseas trade and the fertility of its cultivated land, these festoons were given prominent place in the contemporary series of prints published to disseminate the town hall's plans, structure, and sculptural program. The nobleman Everhard Meister, a friend and neighbor of the architect, even singled out the garlands for particular praise in his 1655 poem on the town hall. What artist, Meister wrote, could be found who would find himself so able to compose festoons with greater art than this, and to entwine the fruits of land and sea in a manner so very swish? And my translation is to pick up on the rhyme in the Dutch. These verses may strike a playful note, but in his scrupulous attention to the town hall, even down to its ornamental details, Meister shows us that the building captivated contemporaries with a visual and structural language that was at once venerable and novel in the Dutch context. By the mid-17th century, the revival of antiquity was rather exhausted as an enterprise for its own sake, and the emphasis lay instead on the justification of classical form in the present circumstance. We have seen so far that De Ruyter's tomb grounds its monumental rhetoric upon the dual foundation of church and state. We have seen that it harnesses the architecture of Amsterdam's city center to align its subject with the prosperity, faith, and stability of the Republic as a whole. But where does it stand in relation to its own sepulchral tradition? No other monument among the Admiral tombs made such intentional use of its location or performed such daring conquest of space. Even the closest forebear to De Ruyter's monument, the tomb of the second most famous Dutch Admiral Martin Tromp, terrible name, looks diminished by comparison. Although the design of its facade and effigy relate closely to the central tableau of the De Ruyter tomb, and although the two trumpeting tritons already appear at its summit, the monument is far more static and sticks far more closely to the plane of the wall. And you can really see that in the side view. Nor is its placement in a corner of Delft's Oude Kerk nearly as prominent. Without the tritons at his side, Tromp seems permanently laid to rest, still and immovable within his place in history. If Tromp and the admirals before him were heroes of their nation, De Ruyter was something greater still, a nation builder outright. De Ruyter's singular status in the lineage of Dutch admirals was already evident in the response that accompanied his lavish funeral. Although he was not the first admiral to receive a state burial, the solemnities in his honor were oriented uniquely less toward commemoration than toward an imagined future present. Of course, there was still plenty of ululation to go around. On the day itself, Amsterdam residents rented out their attics and stoops to those willing to pay for a better view of the spectacle, though according to the admiral's effusive biographer, Gerhard Brandt, it was a sense of communal gratitude and not just the pomp and circumstance of the procession itself that drew the eager crowds. Every mouth, so Brandt writes, was full of De Ruyter's praise, and every tongue proclaimed his heroic deeds and loyal service to the fatherland. The flood of verses and orations that accompanied the funeral was indeed extraordinary, by far surpassing the attention that any previous admiral had received over the preceding decades. Published as newsprints, pamphlets, and in compendia volumes, most of these works took the form of rhetorically charged laments over de Ruyter's corpse. They protest the Republic's loss and align their subject in typical encomiastic fashion with the storied heroes of the past. Yet once again, a central leitmotif in this literary outpouring was more unusual, a persistent call for the construction of a physical monument in de Ruyter's honor. Reversing the topos of Horace's famous ode, which proclaimed the poet's verses a monument more lasting than bronze, de Ruyter's eulogists repeatedly proclaimed the need for a tangible site of memory to ensure that future citizens of the Republic would continue to find inspiration in his example. What sort of monument would be appropriate, however, was a question that most of these authors avoided or answered in the most general terms. They imagined the tomb as huge, marble, enduring, blah, 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 a mirror of his virtues and deeds. These literary commonplaces for describing what a monument should be and do are in many respects misleading and of limited use for understanding the tomb itself. One provocative exception, however, was the oration delivered in Leiden in 1676 by the local bookseller and historian Adrianus Severinus, who also published one of the compendia volumes dedicated to de Ruyter at the time of his burial. In the oration, at the conclusion of his having chronicled the Admiral's many achievements, Severinus writes in his speech regarding the future tomb that should be erected in de Ruyter's honor. It should be a monument, so Severinus declared, not like those tombs of the ancient Egyptians, which, showing a slavish esteem for death, invest more in the resting places of corpses than in the representation of their lives, tombs which only serve to house and are so named eternal dwellings. Let us not erect such a pitiful waste that devouring time will only destroy, but rather a monument like the Roman rostra, composed from the mass of captured ships, adorned with so many flags as adorned de Ruyter's hard-won triumphs. And what then, Severinus continues? This tomb will not only serve as de Ruyter's grave, but will also envelop the hearts of its onlookers with such a deep and worthy sorrow that even their distant descendants, envious of the fortune of this great conqueror, will constantly strive to enlarge his honored corpse with new penance and to pass on the memory of de Ruyter unbroken to future generations. In this passage, Severinus makes a remarkable attempt to define the effect that de Ruyter's monument should achieve in the context of the Dutch Republican nation. He rejects the model of architectural mausoleums like the Egyptian pyramids, and by extension, the tradition of architectural tombs as a whole, with their emphasis on death and the past. He favors instead the model of the rostra, or speaker's platform in ancient Rome, on which politicians and rhetoricians like Cicero stood to deliver their orations. De Ruyter's monument is meant to be a vibrant platform for the shaping of community and nation, rather than a static monument only intended to inspire remembrance. It is telling that another of de Ruyter's eulogists, the Amsterdam scholar Petrus Francis, who delivered the oration at the Admiral's actual funeral in the Nieuwe Kerk, later had himself portrayed in this portrait by Ludolf Backhausen directly in front of the monument in a stance quite deliberate. Much like the figure of the foreground captain and lieutenant in Rembrandt's famous Night Watch, a painting that is a kind of monument in itself, Francis is walking forth from the tomb in a rhetorical posture. But if those leaders in Rembrandt's painting, before their militia, expressed the company's shared intention of defending the city of Amsterdam and their nation by extension, Francis stands before de Ruyter's tomb as if about to conquer his audience with effective words. He is presented giving voice to the mentality of de Ruyter's monument. He stands before a platform designed to affect the hearts and minds of future generations, and his performance takes its cue from the noise and action of the tomb itself. Indeed, Severinus and his fellow Dutch scholars knew from their antiquarian and numismatic studies that the Roman rostra had been built from the wood of captured ships and adorned with the spoils of naval conquests. They knew that its very structure expressed power and imperial dominion as much as it supported open debate or exchange. De Ruyter's monument, with its emphasis on the admiral's perpetual washing up on the shores of the present, figures the admiral precisely in Severinus's words as the conqueror who brought home the spoils upon which his nation was built. Trumpeted by the surrounding Tritons, de Ruyter's body is displayed on the former altar of the Nieuwe Kerk in everlasting triumph, a rhetoric echoed by the verses carved beneath the tomb, which claimed that even Europe was too small for him, and that de Ruyter subjugated the entire globe from America to Asia. This rhetoric of global dominion already manifest in the eulogies on the occasion of de Ruyter's funeral. The Dutch poetess, Catharina Liskaya, wrote in terms abominable to us today of the admiral's matchless achievement. In her words, his might, which was never surpassed, so encompassed the entire earth en masse that at his death, black Moors and Indians turned white with shock, and each for a moment shuddered and balked. Liskaya evokes one of de Ruyter's most celebrated conquests, which was obsessively documented in the contemporary Dutch media. In the early 1660s, as England was gaining power and controlling the Americas, de Ruyter and his fleet were sent on a secret mission to recapture Dutch slave ports along the Gold Coast of Africa and ensure the Republic's continued supply of slave labor. The mission was in many respects a useless one and served most immediately to incite the Second Anglo-Dutch War. But then as now, the media told a different story. This frontispiece to an effusive printed account of de Ruyter's African mission adopts an iconography already evident in posthumous images of his precursor, Martin Tromp. This engraving, which figures Tromp as a triumphant Neptune, was designed to advertise silver medals minted as mementos and collectibles on the occasion of Tromp's death. These medals were also monuments, which achieve monumentality through their potential for circulation rather than through grand scale. But whereas Tromp was only given this kind of visual treatment after the fact, de Ruyter, already in his lifetime, was crowned in this frontispiece not just as a new Neptune, but again as a conqueror. He is surrounded by Tritons explicitly portrayed as African in their skin color and physiognomy, an iconography that makes him master both of the seas and of a foreign continent, and his deeds ensured the continued strength of the Republic's coveted colonial domains. In this respect, de Ruyter's monument picks up on the rhetoric of overseas power expressed in so many maritime paintings of the 17th century Netherlands and in the allegorical frontispieces advertising the navigational maps and charts that the Dutch excelled at producing. In this frontispiece by the great cartographer Willem Blauw, knowledge of the earth, heavens, and seas, which the sailors in the foreground so eagerly study and digest, manifests in the ships topped by the nation's fluttering flags that sail out into the distance, extending the Republic still further beyond its shores. De Ruyter's monument, with its costly marble, its imagery of triumph and conquest, and its prominent place at the center of Amsterdam, performs the glory of that overseas empire brought home. So much for the humble expression of Republican virtue and ideals. Here I want to conclude by considering how far de Ruyter's monument and its performance of monumentality strayed from the original intentions that inspired the tradition of the Dutch admiral tombs to begin with. In 1937, the American architectural critic Louis Mumford wrote a famous essay titled The Death of the Monument that is striking in its parallel to the funerary oration of Adrianus Severinus that we've already seen. Mumford begins his essay by evoking, quote, the human impulse to create everlasting monuments, from primitive burial mounds to the pyramids of Egypt to the tombs of the European Renaissance. He declares that this tradition has now exhausted its purpose. He writes, "The very notion of a modern monument is a contradiction in terms, and declares the need for new forms and structures that are dynamic and adaptable to the changing needs of modern culture and urban space. A monument cannot be modern, nor can something modern ever be called a monument," as Mumford claims. Little did Mumford know that Severinus had already made much the same argument about a tomb in the Netherlands almost 300 years earlier, a tomb that evokes the timeless will to power no less than Manhattan's Trump Tower. Severinus and Mumford were both speaking and thinking in ideal terms. Any monumental structure, whether made of marble or steel, is not dynamic and adaptable, but fixed and immobile. The creators of Michiel de Ruyter's tomb may have thought that they achieved the ultimate culmination of Republican ideals in material form. But what they achieved instead is a monument that performs the contradictions of a nation caught between its modern ideals and its old imperial ambitions. A monument to an uncertain present and elusive future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marisa. And it seems like this panel is moving in reverse chronology, moving from the 18th and 19th century to the 17th century, and now to the Imperial, Roman, and late Antique period, with a talk by Anne-Marie Yasin, who holds a joint appointment at USC in art history and classics. She's a specialist in the social and political dimensions of sacred architecture and art, something demonstrated in her book on saints and church spaces in the late antique Mediterranean, published by Cambridge University Press in 2009. She also has a forthcoming book on rebuilding histories, architectural temporality from Augustus to Justinian. She's taught in the past at Northwestern, and she's also the recipient of many prestigious prizes, including the Rome Prize at the American Academy in Rome, a fellowship at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C., and she's currently also a fellow at the American Council of Learned Societies. So please welcome Anne-Marie.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm already super excited about the dovetails that I've already seen, so hopefully some of you will see those too. There is no shortage of Roman historical sources from the imperial period to indicate that magnificent public buildings were perceived as monuments. They commemorated the accomplishments and civic generosities of their builders and were valued both as glories of cities and empire and as signs of stability and prosperity for the admiration and edification of future generations. This, for example, we can see this in numerous sources, but just to pull out one famous passage from Vitruvius's dedication of his De Architectura to Augustus. Quote, "I undertook to write these things for you, because I saw that you had built and are now building much, and that in the time remaining you would take care of both public and private buildings, so that memorials be handed down to posterity on the scale of your great achievements." So this kind of notion of the durability of monuments and their ability to point in both directions, as we've already heard, sort of started thinking about already this morning, backwards as well as forwards, is something that's already deeply embedded in the Roman sort of way of thinking about monuments, memorials. And yet, Roman authors were also acutely aware of issues of material damage and degradation. They expressed concern about the durability of monuments, often using them metaphorically in contemplations about longevity, or moralistically in critiques of vainglory, or pointedly juxtaposing them to the staying power of historical or literary texts. Indeed, recent research on Roman concepts of monumenta in literary usage has stressed the complicated and multivalent role that they played in discourses about time and materiality. As Don Fowler, a particularly incisive reader of Latin literature, writes, quote, "The essence of the monument is paradoxically its lack of monumental stability, the way in which it is constantly reused and given new meaning." His study is mostly about Latin literature, but we'll see why I find this formulation particularly useful. So following Fowler's invitation to examine the ways in which Roman monuments were, quote, "constantly reused and given new meaning," my paper today looks at Roman buildings, not at the time of their creation, but at subsequent moments of appropriation, when they were restored or rebuilt by later Roman patrons. Specifically, I focus on the reworking of earlier architectural monuments that, it was claimed, had been damaged by the corrosive effects of time. So, section 1, time, the enemy of monuments. Even in the Roman Imperial period, and I just have to give us a visual here from this recent VR reconstruction project that Bernie Fischer and his team have been working on in the Roman Forum and in other parts of Rome. The era we most associate with resplendent marble-clad structures bedecking city centers across the empire, age and deterioration of buildings were never far from patrons' concern and public imagination. We find two spectacularly well-preserved examples in the capital of Rome itself. In 52 CE, the Emperor Claudius completed the monument we call the Porta Maggiore, at the point where a pair of elevated aqueduct channels crossed over two main roads or highways leading into the city from the east. A huge dedicatory inscription carved on the upper portion of the attic of both suburban and city-facing sides of the massive rusticated travertine monument celebrated Claudius's original construction. I'm not going to read the text, but you can see it there at the top in huge letters. And I should just point out, many of the inscriptions that are less visible to us, these would have been painted. The carved letters had paint, probably red. It's most often red paint, so they would have been much more visible against the white stone. Shortly thereafter, however, the same facades were twice more inscribed, these times to advertise restorations by two later 1st century emperors. This set of imposing inscriptions carved across the faces of the arches, the same two faces, evoked the structure's prior dilapidation, describing it as having been interrupted and tumbled or collapsed, intermissas dilapsasque, in a text commemorating Vespasian's reconstruction in 71 CE that was placed directly beneath Claudius's dedication and, quote, "collapsed from the foundations by age." In Titus's restoration inscription, added below his father, Vespasian's, just 10 years later. Even Hadrian's Pantheon, or Trajan and Hadrian's Pantheon, perhaps, is a new dating of the brick stamps has led us to believe that Hadrian finished it around 25 CE, when restored by Septimius Severus in Caracalla in 201 or 202 CE, received an inscription on its facade, now much less visible than it was, originally. The 19th century bronze letters installed here have been added, makes this more visible, but it is absolutely massive, 70 centimeters or so tall, these letters of that are commemorating Agrippa, set up in Hadrian's time in the 2nd century, and then these letters, this inscription added in the very beginning of the 3rd century. So this 3rd century inscription on the facade, describing it as having been brought low by time, vetustate corruptum, directly below the celebrated dedication inscription that Hadrian's structure displayed as if copied from Agrippa's original 1st century BCE temple on the site. These famous monuments are hardly isolated cases. While many Roman rebuilding inscriptions offer seemingly straightforward historical records of the work accomplished, so-and-so rebuilt this in such and such a year, it turns out that a great number, the majority in fact, are more elaborate, with many drawing explicit attention to the damage previously sustained by the structure. And we can even quantify this. A survey of some 569 Latin Restoration inscriptions from across the empire, dating from the end of the 2nd century BCE to the turn of the 6th century CE, found that 348 indicate reasons for reconstruction. Of these, 193, or 56%, list time, most often rendered vetustas, which is perhaps more accurately understood as aging, as a reason for the need for the building's restoration. An additional handful, 8 examples, point the finger at both time and neglect. We have, in other words, over 200 surviving Latin inscriptions, nearly 60% of all of those that record reasons for restoration at all, that spelled out the passage of time as the culprit. Scores more from the Eastern Mediterranean expressed similar sentiments in Greek. Restoration projects, in other words, across the geographic and chronological span of the Roman and early Byzantine empires, regularly went beyond pragmatic concerns of providing stable, functional buildings. The act, indeed the very concept of rebuilding, was itself memorialized in grand form and was regularly cast as a response to the relentless menace of decay. Put another way, many of the structures that we think of as emblematic of Roman architectural monumentality and endurance presented ancient viewers with a more temporally contingent display of their material integrity and durability. The central question that has troubled scholars who've examined this material is, was it true? For Edmund Thomas and Christian Witschel, the authors of the study that included the quantification numbers I just cited, the answer is often no, or at least probably not. The incredibly high frequency of the damaged by time assertions, as well as the fact that in many cases, the relatively short span of time between the building's original construction and its restoration, led the authors to argue that when an inscription blames old age for a building's collapse, it is more symbolic than strictly accurate. It is, they reason, simply too common a trope, and often made even in cases that are frankly too incredible to be true. While others have been a bit more cautious, on balance, the consensus is now that we ought not automatically to take the claims spelled out on the monumental inscriptions that commemorated architectural restoration at face value. This is undoubtedly correct, but I don't think it gets us as far as we'd like, since it doesn't adequately account for what lies behind the attraction, or the success, if you will, of the trope of time's damage, and of a restored building's former ruin. Rather than debate its literal accuracy, I suggest that we consider more fully the rhetorical value, or even in some instances the political expediency of declaring that the building one has just restored had been destroyed by time. To do so, we need to expand our view beyond the epigraphic record to the sorts of poetic and philosophical texts that drew on and contributed to the metaphors of time's effects on monuments. The inevitability of time's destructive forces to cause material decline and weakness was a long-standing preoccupation of Roman authors. It fed into common literary tropes about the relative merit of text versus physical monuments for preserving the memory of accomplishments, as Horace famously articulated it in the last poem of his 3rd book of Odes, which we've just already heard referenced in Marisa's paper. Quote, "I have completed a monument more lasting than bronze and higher than the regal site of the pyramids, a monument that the devouring rain cannot destroy, nor the violent north wind, nor the innumerable series of years and the flight of time. The mutability of all things, bodies to buildings, was a particular concern in Epicurean circles. Lucretius's famous passage in the De Rerum Natura hammers the point home with an expansive series of negative constructions across 12 lines of verse and a veritable compendium of vivid language for physical destruction. Do you not see that even stones are conquered by time, that tall turrets and rocks tumble, that the gods' temples and their images wear out and crack, nor can their holy divinity carry forward the boundaries of fate, nor strive against nature's laws? Again, do we not see the monuments of men fall to pieces?" And so on. For Lucretius, stone serves as the ultimate proof of his atomistic natural philosophy. All things, even mountains and stone monuments, are subject to time's disintegrating force. These metaphors and meditations on time's destructive power continued to carry robust currency in the late antique period. The 4th century poet, this is really one of my favorites, this is great. The 4th century poet Ausonius composed an epigram about an inscription that was no longer legible. Quote, Lucius is one letter, but it is separated by twin points. After, an M is inscribed. At least I think so. It is not at all visible. The top has been damaged by the stone breaking off. The letters lie disturbed with their shapes truncated. All have perished in a confusion of signs. Are we surprised that men die? Monuments gape apart. Death comes even to stones and names. Likewise, Cassiodorus, writing in the beginning of the 6th century, reports that when Theodoric wrote to the patrician Symmachus regarding the condition of the theater of Pompey in Rome, he lamented the effects of time on the fabric of the impressive building. Quote, Old age, can nothing resist you? Since you can shatter even this solid structure, one would have thought it more likely for mountains to subside than this strong building to be shaken. Against the backdrop of such a cultural milieu, that a stone monument would suffer physical deterioration over time, as claimed by the Porta Maggiore, the Pantheon, and hundreds of other Roman reconstruction inscriptions, would have been far from controversial. And that, I suggest, is precisely the point. So now I want to unpack this a bit further. Section 3. The monument has crumbled. Long live the monument. While inscriptions that cited the destructive physical effects of aging grew on broader literary and cultural tropes, central to their mission, to their effect, was their capacity to literally attach this truism to real monuments in the world, monuments whose physical form, whose material and spatial presence was palpable to all who read the inscribed text's claims. In some cases, as we've seen at the Porta Maggiore and the Pantheon, the restoration inscriptions were added to buildings which patently still stood, as witnessed by their conspicuous juxtaposition to the structure's original dedication inscriptions, which even today remain in situ. Indeed, the preservation of the extant dedication inscriptions, now textually and visibly reframed by the commemoration of the subsequent restorations, offered a powerfully graphic mechanism for later benefactors to link their own work to that of their predecessors, shaping a sense of lineage, however real or fictive, between generations of patrons. An even more aggressive strategy can be found in cases in which we see a damaged by time claim applied to quote-unquote restored monuments that were effectively new structures. A famous late antique example is illustrative here. The huge early 6th century church of St. Paleuktos, Hagios Paleuktos in Constantinople, which is seen here in its excavated substructures. We don't actually have the superstructures of the building, except for what tumbled into the substructures, was adorned with a dedicatory epigram in praise of its donor, Anicia Juliana, that comprised an incredible 76 lines of hexameter verse, the full text of which was preserved in the literary collection of inscriptions known as the Palatine Anthology. The excavations that followed the accidental discovery of the church site in 1960 unearthed 7 substantial fragments of the poem carved in luxurious relief on the entablature encircling the nave. And I show you 3 examples here on the slide. The opening lines of the St. Paleuktos poem began, as they've been reconstructed by Bardell, they began here just right of the sanctuary and worked their way down, looping around the nave. So these opening lines positioned at the southeast end of the nave, running toward the entrance, begin with a characterization of the church explicitly as a rebuilding. They hail not the 6th century patron Juliana of this church, but the benefactor behind the original shrine on the site. Quote, Empress Eudokia, in her zeal to honor God, built the first church of divinely inspired Paleuktos. Continuing down the nave, it's a very long poem, I'm just giving you excerpts, but continuing further down the nave, the text continues, thence Juliana raised this from a small church to its present size and beauty, increasing the glory of her many sceptered ancestors. From its very start, therefore, the epigram declares Juliana's structure as a magnificent upgrade of an earlier church that had been built over half a century earlier by her great-grandmother, Empress Athanase Eudokia, wife of Theodosius II. Immortality and the memory conferred through great works is a theme underscored here and reprised throughout the poem. It is in that context that a second set of verses, which were at the church's entrance outside the narthex, should be read. What choir is sufficient to sing the labors of Juliana? She alone overpowered time and overtook the wisdom of Solomon by raising a church to receive God. And even long age cannot celebrate its glittering and elaborate beauty. This portion of the text is justifiably famous for its bold boast it makes about Juliana rivaling Solomon. But it is also important to note that the poem's implied comparison of her structure to the lost Temple of Jerusalem is paired with a boast about her overpowering time. We see the rhetoric of a ruined by time claim paired with the claim of a magnificent replacement taken to extremes in the text of Procopius's On Buildings, written about 20 or 30 years after Juliana's impressive carved poem. Over and over again in Procopius's text of praise for the Emperor Justinian's prodigious construction projects across the Byzantine Empire, we hear of time, or the long passage of time, blamed for the woeful condition of abandoned cities, or being the cause of the pitiful before state of the structures that the emperor had restored. Procopius tells us, for example, I just pull out one relatively brief example to illustrate the point, that the shrine of the martyr Saint Panteleimon in Constantinople, quote, had suffered greatly from the long passage of time. He then goes on to write that Justinian removed it completely from the spot and in its place built in a very magnificent manner, the church which now stands on the site. In Procopius's case, playing off the widely accepted trope of old buildings reduced to ruin allowed him to depict Justinian's restorations as crucial structural interventions while simultaneously eliding and upstaging the architectural efforts of previous patrons. Most of these, as in this example of the St. Panteleimon shrine, are not even named and so are lost to us, but they would undoubtedly have been known to contemporaries. Memory of earlier benefactors is effectively obliterated with Justinian's rebuilding of the monuments that those original builders, had originally founded. In the case of Anicia Juliana's church, we see the poem's author striking a more delicate balance. The elite patron's epigram at once draws on the cachet of Juliana's family link to the original construction, while also subtly justifying her need to tear it down. As we have seen, these examples, along with the scores of more modest restoration texts on buildings across the Mediterranean that blame the passage of time for their crumble, conform to a broader cultural perception, even cliché, about the inevitability of time's deleterious effects. Indeed, I'd argue this is precisely why it was such a common element, and such a valuable one, in descriptions of architectural restoration. These claims naturalize the assertion that a building needs reconstruction because time's degradation of physical structures is unquestioned and taken to be inevitable. It moreover casts the act of reworking an earlier patron's monument as impersonal, a necessary and justifiable response to the inevitable corrosion of time. It's thus a useful rhetorical tool in patrons' efforts to negotiate multiple ideals. An ideal on the one hand of celebrating their own civic magnanimity, while on the other hand manipulating the memory of the original donors. Now my fourth and final section of the talk, restoration's ekphrases, conjuring ghosts of former buildings. At the same time, the building described as ruined is no longer visible in literal terms to contradict claims made about its degradation. It exists instead only in the image of it created by the rebuilt monument. The former structure becomes a blank slate, and inversely, the restored or replacement building becomes in turn also a monument to that old structure's destruction. Once the monument was restored, the inscription on it shaped an image of the former building as having needed restoration, while simultaneously taking on the air of proof of that fact through the authoritative medium of the monumental commemoration inscription. The actual truth is not so much at issue here as the fact that it was styled as such. In the earlier imperial examples of damaged by time inscriptions, the most common descriptors of the original replaced buildings are past participles of verbs that emphasize its lack of physical integrity, with action words that highlight collapsing movement. Conlapsus, participle of conlabor, to fall together, to fall in ruins, crumble. The related word delapsus, from delabor, to fall asunder, go to pieces, tumble. And corruptus, from caruo, to fall together, tumble, tumble down, sink to the ground. This evocative vocabulary carved onto restored monuments presents a picture of the structure's former physical ruin and an image of the site's immediate past as a building disintegrated. This widespread, but nevertheless formulaic and vague epigraphic terminology of collapse gave way in the late antique period to more elaborate and semantically vivid descriptions of former buildings. In a trend that took off from the 4th to late 6th centuries, many restoration inscriptions went well beyond merely citing the past's time-caused damage. One study has quantified the trend through a regional survey of inscriptions from North Africa. It found that building inscriptions that included descriptions of the former state of the building comprised 3% of cases in the 1st century CE, 6% from the 2nd century, 17% from the 3rd century, and jumped to 41% in the 4th and 5th centuries, where the survey leaves off. With increasing frequency, in other words, restoration inscriptions lavished extended attention on the effects of time's damage, turning over hefty segments of epigraphic real estate to crafting verbal impressions of buildings no longer visible to the eye. Let's take a closer look at one example of these. Unfortunately, I can't show you the actual stone, and we don't know, it was not found in situ, but we know the site that it came from. This example is from an inscription set up in the 360s in Kalama, modern Guelma, Algeria, to commemorate the restoration of a pool, probably from one of the public bath complexes of the city. After an elaborate set of dating formulae, we read that the patron, one Quintus Basilius Flacianus, quote, restored the pool, which before used to hold a sluggish trickle of a narrow water channel, but now truly overflows with the motion of thundering torrents. Here, the goal was clearly to heighten the contrast between the former state of the pool with its present revised installation, and thereby impress upon viewers the donor's accomplishment even further. But beyond the intensification of what scholars frequently dismiss as typically bombastic late antique rhetoric, we should underscore the increasingly ekphrastic character and sensory emphasis of the restoration inscriptions such as this one. This, I would stress, is a critical aspect of their effect. In the Kalama inscription, the restored pool, before which viewers would undoubtedly have stood as they read it, was experienced through the lens of the text. The words invite us to experience Flacianus' pool not only as new, but gushing and loud, overflowing, thundering, and as we are witnessing the overabundant and roaring flow, or whatever kind of flow it was that we are invited to witness as roaring, the text's quae antea, which before, opens up an imaginative window into the past and its sluggish water trickle. Through the contrasting clauses, before versus now, quae antea juxtaposed against nunc, and the vivid descriptions of the water connected to each of them, the text encourages a sensory reflection on the relation between the present site and its former state. Over and against the truth value of the inscription's claims about the thunderousness of the restored flow or its prior weakness, the text creates for readers an experience of the earlier, no longer visible, or for that matter, hearable pool. We might call it an invented memory of the former site. Regardless of what might have been actually experienced and recalled about the earlier water feature, the inscription demands that it ever after be recalled or imagined as thinner, weaker, generally crappier, antecedent of the present, patently abundant installation. In the late 5th and into the 6th century, commemoration of architectural renovations incorporated even more sensorially loaded evocations of replaced monuments. One of the most striking examples comes from the last years of the 5th or early years of the 6th century in Gerasa, modern Jerash, Jordan. There, the priest Aeneas built a large church dedicated to St. Theodore, immediately to the west of the 4th century church, which has been dubbed the cathedral by the excavators. The chronology of Aeneas' construction is certain, thanks to the survival of a dated inscription surmounting one of the church's entrances from the west. Before this, however, visitors approaching the atrium of St. Theodore from the road on the complex's west side would have encountered a doorway with a lengthy versed inscription overhead praising the patron's construction. The text called out to the viewer with an arresting set of descriptions. Quote, "I have been made at once an amazement and a marvel to those passing by, for the entire cloud of disorderliness has been dispersed, and instead of the former eyesore and all the grace of God has surrounded me, and formerly so many four-footed toiling beasts fell down here that a stomach-turning stench arose. And often somebody nearby pinched his nose and gave up the desire for breathing to avoid the bad smell. But now, those passing over the fragrant ground carry their right hand to their brows, making the sign of the honorable cross." Scholars have examined this inscription as a powerful statement both of Christian classical learning, which is 13 hexameters, which include a direct Homeric quotation in the 11th verse, proudly declared, as well as of victory, both of which it undoubtedly was. But the text is also a very particular kind of appeal to the early Byzantine spectator. It was one that not only pronounced victory, but did so with striking, direct first-person address from the building to the passerby, and through the visceral sensory evocation of the past place that, it claimed, formerly stood on the very site of the present building. In this case, great emphasis is placed on the smell, as well as on the exaggeration and extension of the effects of smell on the rest of the body and soul. The twinning of bodily gestures of hands to face in the imagined before and after experiences of the site both inscribe and describe a set of somatic responses to olfactory stimuli, past and present. Such ekphrastic evocations of buildings no longer visible do not simply report or record past destruction, they form it, molding the viewer's perception of it into a sort of architectural ghost of the former structure. And in describing the bodily responses evoked by the former site, they fashion corporeal memories of it. Regardless of how empirically accurate they were or weren't, once in place, the carved descriptions literally wrote a truth about the past. Above and beyond earlier generic claims about age-inflicted decay, the ekphrases of prior sites are vividly sensory. From Kalama's formerly sluggish and turgid water to St. Theodore's former stench, the restored monuments encourage their viewers not only to imagine its earlier ruinous state, but to experience bodily the past of the site as a distinctively objectionable place. In conclusion, the language of Roman and late antique restoration inscriptions regularly drew currency from the broader cultural trope of time's inevitable breakdown of the material world. Such claims naturalized the perceived need for restoration work, justifying intervention on and appropriation of previous patrons' monuments. It therefore allowed for an elision of anything potentially objectionable about updating or replacing the former building, and offered a setup against which to juxtapose the more magnificent structures that followed. The claim could, in other words, normalize and make appear acceptable what may have been quite overt, even controversial interventions on the urban landscape. Moreover, an inscribed text operates very differently from one that circulates in literary form. It is site-specific and operates on spatial and material dimensions in addition to the textual. When physically juxtaposed to older inscribed texts, it redefines the founder's accomplishment as but the first chapter in a longer structural biography, the present manifestation of which is credited to the interventions of subsequent patrons. It also crafts memories of the former pre-restored state of the monument state of the site as a monument in ruin. Architectural inscriptions that additionally incorporated ekphrases, evocative descriptions of the monument themselves, were increasingly frequent in the 4th to 6th centuries, which were increasingly frequent, were more emphatically multidimensional. Those that described in grandiose terms the monument on which they appear aimed to direct viewers' attention and guide/control the reception of the structure. The relationship between text and architecture is predicated on their alignment and their mutual reinforcement. Textual content sets up and validates the architectural frame, and the real, observable architecture underscores the truth value of the textual claims. Those like the inscription on Kalama's pool, and from Jerasch's Church of St. Theodore that also presented visceral evocations of the replaced monument, similarly operate in terms of a back and forth dialectical relationship between the described and the observed. In these cases, the image called up in the mind's eye, as well as nose and hand, contrasts dramatically with the surrounding visual and sensory evidence that the body takes in. Yet the paradox remains. The widespread writing and rewriting of time's inevitable destruction on rebuilt monuments across the empire belies ongoing concern that buildings that advertise an old structure's demise could too fall prey to time's deleterious effects. Thank you.
So thanks so much to the three speakers for really wonderful, stimulating talks. I'd like to invite them up here for our discussion. So there have been so many unexpected and fascinating thematic connections. I guess, first of all, I'd like to open it to the speakers if you guys have questions for each other, or if not, to the public as well. Yeah?
I would have, but I don't volunteer to be first, and somebody has to.
Yeah.
I would have two brief questions to both of you, really inspiring talks that you gave. So one question would be to Anne-Marie, and both of you quoted Horace. And I also have my secret Horace angle, which I didn't talk about. But I mean, when you think of, I'm kind of interested in the question of the genre. So Horace talks about the monument he created, obviously a text. But certain quotes from Horace get monumental quality. For instance, the famous one, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, it's sweet and glorious to die for the fatherland. And this is also from the Odes, book 3. And what's interesting is that this has become the battle cry for many soldiers who died in the battlefield. Except that Horace, there's a famous debate about that, probably didn't meant it to be like that. And there's a huge controversy, which I can't expand upon. But the thing is, here we have a line that becomes monumental, as it were, overpowering, and we have a distortion of the original meaning. And this happens a lot to texts, because texts have a context. This line has a context, the ode before, the ode after that, and that is why it gets messy and more ambivalent. Now, would there be comparable kind of openings when it comes to the meaning of a monument, comparable variations, if we don't talk about text but about sculpture? So that would be my basically probably question to both of you. And the other question, I mean, obviously the closest connection we have is your Mumford quote, yeah. Right? The very notion of a modern monument is a contradiction in terms, and and part of my story talking about a monument that serves the purpose of celebrating the present is kind of an attempt to create a modern monument, and I would be interested in you basically jumping from your period, possibly to Mumford's period, how we exactly, how we deal with this funeral of the monument. Obviously, there's something odd about the funeral because we are talking about it now, and it can't be all dead.
Maybe I'll answer that first, and then yeah, I think I had an undergraduate professor who loved to declare that if you want to like sell something, then say that everything's dying and declining, because everybody loves that story, right? It's easy to say that, you know, the death of the monument happened at any number of moments in history, I think. I think that your example, like mine, but in a different way, shows the challenge of making a modern monument. I mean, the colossal figure, the giant, is interesting because it's ephemeral. It can be a monument of the present because it doesn't have to try to last. So that's one solution, of course, to make ephemeral monuments. And I think ephemerality is very interesting in the context of the history of monuments because they are much better at being modern and of the moment than something like a monumental sculpture that's going to stay there and then people forget or they reinterpret. And I would say to your question about can physical monuments and not just textual monuments, their histories be rewritten, I think absolutely. I mean, that goes back, that's really what Riegel was talking about in his 1903 essay already. It is sort of the unintentional monument is one that didn't maybe, or an intentional monument can become an unintentional monument when its original intention is forgotten and its story is rewritten. I think that happens all the time. That is, I mean, you use the word paradox, you were talking about the paradox of monuments. I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah, no, thank you. My sense is that what you're getting at is the sort of reception of Horace as well as the reception of monuments and where there might be a parallel, because the excerpting of a quote and taking it out of context is not something I know that I would see as directly parallel to the kinds of restored buildings that I'm thinking of. But I do think it has an interesting parallel in the realm of things that we would be concerned with today, which is more on the fragment, the architectural fragment or the spolium, the object that is a trace of the past, which that is useful and repurposed and sort of it can become a sort of galvanizing bit to latch onto and define yourself against, either as holding it up as, you know, a bit of lost glory or as a something to be triumphed over. So my sense is that the analogy between a kind of quote of, a misused quote of Horace in its later iterations could be something like the spolium. I'm also thinking, though, that notion of the, I was so intrigued by the example in your paper of this really direct inspiration almost of Horace. At least it seemed that way, this sort of imbibing of Horace and updating it. That did seem to me quite, you know, I don't think that there's anything quite that direct that I'm aware of in the classical period in terms of architectural epigraphic practices, but there's very self-conscious. That Horace was incredibly influential in antiquity, and that passage, it is kind of, if not directly echoed, it's very much in the minds of many writers. And we get the notion not only of his, but he's not the origin of the trope, but it is formulated, I think, so even complexly in his own text. And maybe that's part of what you're getting at, Dieter, that in Horace it's not straightforward either in his own text.
Questions from the audience or from speakers? One thing that struck me listening to Dieter's talk after the first slide, most of the subsequent slides were actually not monuments. They were images printed or illustrated for projects realized or unrealized. And it struck me, thinking from that talk forward, that apart from the bricks and mortar physicality of the monument itself, there's a kind of intermedial or intertextual dimension that the monuments themselves interact with. So whether that's the conjuring up of a public or a collective in the kind of 18th century ideal of a republic of letters, or of the idea that rhetoric, in the case of the Dutch humanists that Marisa spoke about, has to constantly renew the memory of the monument, or whether in the case of ekphrasis or the kind of size or dimensions of the inscriptions overtaking the facades of certain buildings, that there's this constant intermedial and intertextual dimension. Maybe I'd be interested in maybe a dialogue about this, whether you see connections or distinctions in the intermedial or intertextual dimensions.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm really curious about in the rest of this conference, I guess because our session is representing the West that Mary already evoked. In the West, the monument is, I think, historically understood very specifically to be things made of stone, like architecture and sculpture, right? Whereas my impression is that's really not the larger history of monuments. It's also not true in a European or ancient context at all that that's how monuments are understood. Monuments could be texts, they could be, any number of media. It's not specific to media, even if, and in part I think that restriction comes from the legacy of authors, ancient authors like Horace, and the kind of the endurance of this ruined by time topos. I love that phrase, the ruined by time topos. So I think it's the minute that you recognize that monuments can be in any media, and they can be natural as well as man-made, then the idea that they are also intermedial and that they, they can speak across media and then they also speak across text and image makes a lot of sense. I think there is not, I mean, in the case of my example, there's not a single Admiral tomb that does not have text. And text is, I mean, actually something I didn't show in my images, but the Matilda Outer Monument is entirely buttressed by text, all in very dense Latin. And it takes up a significant space in the monument. So there's an obsession with framing, and I think that idea that, the inscriptions are doing something to create, to try to ensure the kind of performance that the monument's going to have, getting back to what Anne-Marie talked about, that the inscriptions are telling you how you're meant to experience the thing. So there's also, I think, in the specific intermedial context of the relationship between a monument and a material monument and the texts that support it, the texts show almost a kind of anxiety about like making sure things go right, or that you have the kind of right experience in some cases. So, yeah, and another thing I didn't talk about in the monument tombs is also, I think, when you think about the choice of language, so obviously, in a Roman monument, it's going to be in Latin, but a lot of the Dutch tombs utilize the vernacular, which is really interesting because it tells you that even though they're in a kind of ecclesiastical context, they're trying to speak to a broad public. And the Heemskerk monument, the Dutch is at eye level and the Latin is above. And so it's clearly meant, like, here's the most accessible part, and then this is for another level or dimension of the audience. So I think text is interesting on monuments in terms of placement as well. So in yours, it goes top down, right? And then, yeah, sometimes, but it could be in a different, so I think even the visuality and the placement of text is really interesting to think about in a monumental context as well. So.
In your, and apologies if I just missed this, in the the churches by the water with the older
Yeah, the
admirable
outer
tombs.
kirk, yeah.
So that one you showed us multiple admirable tombs. Is that also the case in your main case study?
Yeah.
Or there are other earlier tombs?
So it's interesting. It's a great question. The admiral tombs are pretty much exclusively only in repurposed Catholic churches. So just think about the kind of layers of history that are accruing. So they're never built in dedicated Protestant churches that were made in the 17th century. Most of them are in particular churches that have a kind of lineage within them. So they have that local lineage and then the larger national lineage. There's only one, though, in the Nieuwe Kerk, and it's a fairly modest one. That was also designed by Verhulst, and it's in a corner in the transept. So de Ruyter didn't have to deal with as much tradition, because in the Oude Kerk there is no monument that comes out from the wall in the ways that his does. So his would have actually been a kind of violation in the space of the Oude Kerk, and an epitaph could only be so big because it hangs on the wall. So it's really interesting, actually, because the Nieuwe Kerk was kind of like, that was the overflow from the Oude Kerk, but then, ironically, it allows that monument to be much bigger than it would have been. And it's in this, again, in the center, the sort of like governmental center of the city as well.
Yes, Mary.
Thank you so much for such fascinating presentations. And I have to say, I was quite astounded by all of them. But one of the things that most struck me in the beginning of Dieter's led me to questions for both Marisa and Anne-Marie, which is, and perhaps for Dieter himself as well, is at what point does one begin to read, and of course it requires the survival of a certain kind of ephemera, but a kind of irreverence about the monument, the idea of the cartoon that is lampooning it. For this, in fact, will then be performed in a kind of physical way against and about so many monuments. And Marisa, I was struck at the fact that the perfect condition, by keeping this inside a church, it has gained an extra level of reverence in terms of the monument's treatment through time. But has anyone ever put it into a cartoon, other than something that, again, seemed a little, a kind of Tintin-like hagiographic cartoon, in which we could really sense that there's some kind of conversation about the permanence itself and the kind of self-inflation. I'm just imagining, is there some play by Plautus in which he's making fun of spolia and monuments? And I have no idea. I'm asking the three of you.
So thank you for your question. That's great. This is one of those frustrations, especially Romanists face, of trying to find, like, where do we find the critique? How can we see underneath the official story, the official party line, which we get from most of our surviving evidence, especially the critique of the Imperial project, let's say. I think Plautus is probably too early to see in this case, but I do think that you would find Marshall be a useful source for not so much what is the way monuments look, in the sense that we don't have, archaeological sources aren't going to give us that kind of evidence as much as, I think you put it very well, the reception of the monuments, the way that people are using them, or ignoring them, or having trysts in them, or, I mean, this is the kind of thing that was there laws about, and that's one of the things that's actually another really interesting kind of evidence, is legal sources that are anxious about people either inveighing on other people's tombs or doing illicit stuff in tombs is one that comes up pretty frequently in the jurisdiction about it, but it won't show up necessarily, in an inscription on the ground or even in a kind of layer of the monument, but we do have some cases where we can see that monuments aren't always perceived, or certainly weren't used as having only that programmatic top-down kind of message that they themselves are putting forward.
Yeah, maybe just briefly. So there is this asset that is expected from monuments, that they create cohesion. I liked your word against disorderliness from one of your quotes. So there is this longing for stability and cohesion and this kind of integrating force. And at the same time, obviously, not just in modern times, but all the way through, there's the opposite, a certain longing for irreverence, even longing for triggering debates and some kind of dissent, controversy, and so on and so forth. Morgan, you alluded to that when you talked about the Republic of Letters and so on. And I think it's interesting how these two different kind of urges play out on the level of monuments and on how we deal with monuments. I mean, at some point in time, we have to recall this famous line from Ernest Renan in his text on What is a Nation, or how is it called? And there he says that a nation is a daily plebiscite, or plebiscite, how do you pronounce that in English? Plebiscite?
Plebiscite.
Plebiscite? Plebiscite. Okay, so a daily plebiscite. And what he means, and this is obviously very controversial, is basically an affirmation of something given, the tradition. So you have to say every day, on a daily basis, yes, I stay faithful. And monuments obviously are expected to play this very role, that in front of them you say, yes, this is our admiral, this is our nation. Except that in the word plebiscite, and that's what many people picked up from Renan, late 19th century onwards, is that the plebiscite entails this kind of moment of deciding. So, and possibly not just reconfirming and dutifully, but also re-describing the nation. So the daily plebiscite can kind of gain some leeway when it comes to the tradition it's supposed to confirm only, and go beyond that. And I think this is exactly what then plays out on the level of how you deal with monuments or cartoons of monuments. So all these, I think there is a whole repertoire of how to deal with them, starting from plain ignorance, and that happens a lot, to neglect, to decay, and also to some kind of reappraisal and redescription.
Yeah, and I would add, I think your point about the relation, when does irreverence turn into anger and destruction is really interesting. I hope we'll hear more about that too in the coming days. In the Dutch context, it's particularly interesting because you have the prehistory to the Republic is the 16th century and radical iconoclasm and the destruction of so much in the churches where these monuments now stand. And you're absolutely right that I tried to suggest the idea that they're accruing reverence, but also they're defending themselves by being in a church. And there's a reason that there's only one freestanding public monument erected in the 17th century Netherlands, that statue of Erasmus, weird statue of Erasmus that I showed, is because they put that up and everybody got angry. People were saying, tear this down, why are we treating this guy like a saint? Even though Erasmus is, the great famous scholar of the Netherlands, and he was already a century dead. And the only way they justified it was precisely through what Anne-Marie was describing, which is a history of smaller statues of Erasmus that had moved around Rotterdam in the 16th century, and one of which had been destroyed by the enemy Spanish during the 80 Years' War. And so there was a justification for building it anew. That's the only way it stayed up. Otherwise, it could easily have been torn down. In terms of cartoons of a kind of irreverent character of the kind that Dieter showed, you do not get those in the 17th century, but you do get relics associated with these monuments. So you get painted Dutch tiles that show the tomb of William of Orange, the stadtholder, and little collectibles, essentially, so people could take home their piece of the monument. So it's almost like they built in spolia to something that hadn't actually been destroyed, that people could then accrue for themselves, which is another, I'd be curious if there are other examples of that in the coming days as well.
Yeah, Nicholas.
We can hear you, but not because of that.
Thank you for the papers. And in some ways, we've been talking a lot about the relationship of monuments to the past, in kind of general terms, I think, throughout this year. But your papers also pointed to the relationship of monuments to past monuments, to past objects, to past forms. And it's almost, and it made me think whether it is kind of a growing wiki-edited definition of monumentality that we're working on. Is this do you find this an essential element of monumentality? Does, in some ways, in Marisa's case, do we need to perceive this object in relation to the Admirals tomb in order for this to gain monumentality? Are the buildings that Admiral mentioned become monuments by virtue of a kind of invented or real or kind of destroyed ancestor? Does there have to be a previous monument for every monument? Is, I guess, a kind of more general question.
I'm flipping through my Rolodex of monuments in my head. I mean, in the Roman case, I would say no, there doesn't have to. There are plenty of buildings that are built anew, and they get celebrated as such. And, you know, encomia written for patrons as builders. But even in those cases, it's often the case that they are, you know, that novelty is couched shaped in traditional ways. And sometimes that's through a kind of reference to an earlier iteration on the spot that's out of ephemeral materials, or so like Circus Maximus, right? It was a circus for centuries before the physical structure was built. It was used for horse races, but we didn't have stone seats. And there's a kind of genealogy built into that kind of making permanent and kind of bringing to sort of manifest this sort of grand point that the city and the empire is in the petrification of earlier sites that, you know, places that had been used before but were temporary. So there is that kind of mode. I think that's a little bit different from the rebuilding, though, because there's often not a name of a historical figure attached to those, you know, more mythological or historical origin stories that are featured in so many buildings, especially around Rome itself. Whereas it gets sticky when you have a previous donor who has a family who might still be around, who could still be powerful senators. I mean, you do have to negotiate. It gets much more this kind of dance between, on the one hand, trying to shape the memory and craft it into something that's valuable, useful for you, and either you're kind of aligning yourself or juxtaposing yourself against it. But either way, that sort of crafting the new as just a rebuilding. It's not really new, and yet it can be something that's. I mean, the Annicia Juliana's church it's astounding. I mean, this is this huge church that's, you know, before Justinian built the Hagia Sophia, it was the biggest church in Constantinople, and it's shaping itself or casting itself as just, I'm just rebuilding the earlier church on the site that my great-grandmother built, because that's both a pious thing to do as a toward the saint, but also as pious towards your family. So it's kind of politically expedient, oftentimes in this world anyway, which is very conservative in some ways, to, not champion what's so modern about your structure, but you can build a modern structure. You just have to kind of not make it look or not shout about it as modern so much.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really fascinating question. I think you could think about it in terms of actual monuments as precursors, but then also, so in the Dutch Admiral case, I think it's absolutely true that de Ruyter's monument gained monumentality in part, but not exclusively, from the lineage of monuments that came before him. There's no question. But then there's also the way in which monuments, I mean, you just used the words conservative, as did Mary in her introduction, that monuments are conservative, that they like to refer back to other existing forms, like how many, again, in the Western tradition, how many equestrian monuments, how many triumphal arches, you know, how many men standing on top, you know, figures that they've conquered do we have? That makes, again, that makes monuments look very unmodern. You take de Ruyter's monument is really a very original monument. It's a very new iconography. It's taking it's using imagery from elsewhere and putting it into a monumental context. So it is both in some ways new, but then in some ways related to a tradition. Obviously, there have to be monuments, but I also wonder whether another way of thinking about how monuments build on the past is also, you know, the question of spatiality, that sometimes you just need a site that's already been deemed significant on which to build a monument, even without needing a pre-existing monument itself, but some place that's been deemed significant in some other way. I don't know, I mean, I can think of, well, I mean, for instance, a church that is not a monument that then becomes a site for a public monument, in my case, but I'm guessing there are many others as well. Other examples.
Yeah, I mean, logically speaking, it can't be right that monuments have to refer to previous monuments, because then that would lead to the question of, well, where did the first monument come from?
The monument.
the monument. So this is a kind of a catch 22. So it's. But on the other hand, you have this kind of historicism leading from one step to the next. But so I think. In order to get out of this vicious circle, we have to probably also stress the fact that there is this scene when it comes to monuments that is more likely linked to some kind of historic event that wants to be memorialized.
Could I push against that a little bit? Well, what I found really interesting about this idea of one monument that kind of refers to another monument in a kind of infinite recursion is that it seems particularly apt for explaining the kind of peculiar political conditions that Marisa anticipates and comes to fruition in Dieter's work and also your writings, which is the problem of the representation of an absent collective and the impossibility of representing this collective, which, you know, had nothing to do with the making of the monument to the Dutch people, you know, or, I mean, there was no kind of collective that was part of the decision-making process, or to many of the monuments that come after the French Revolution. And so with this kind of absent referent, you end up almost by necessity creating a kind of semantic hall of mirrors where you know, you point to one authoritative reference point, which then must point to another, and to Hercules, and to a, you know, a stripped down church altar, et cetera, et cetera. And in this sense, I think that there is a peculiar condition that distinguishes some of these modern monuments to the things that Anne-Marie talked about, which you know, where there's a clear patron and there's a kind of clear point of origin. In this case, maybe there is something about modernity that is about this recursion.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. Go ahead. To Jason.
First, sorry.
We good? Oh. Thank you guys very much for this. Your presentations and the conversations that are coming out of it, I'm really appreciating the complexity of looking at the problem of monumentality through each of your presentations. Another example that occurred to me that seemed to reinforce a number of items that you guys were talking about, I kept thinking of Herod the Great, one of the great builders of antiquity, and thinking about his building programs. And Herod was a Jewish king, a controversial one, but a Jewish king, but one who constructed 3 different pagan temples to celebrate the Roman Emperor Augustus as a god. You would want to look at each of those in their individual communities, but in that sense, that was something strikingly new. On the flip side, though, Herod's biggest project was Herod's expansion of the Second Temple. And he made it the biggest, as far as I know, the biggest temple complex in the Mediterranean and Middle East. But there, of course, he's building off of a pre-existing temple, and there were a very complex series of negotiations that went on between Herod on the one hand and the priestly class on the other. Even some of the priests, if I recall correctly from Josephus, had to be taught to build the structure in different ways because no one could see the interior except the priests themselves. So just the balance, I'm thinking, between novelty, but the importance of tradition and referencing and expanding pre-existing monuments, and just the negotiation that goes on at every stage of that just seems, you guys captured it, I think, so nicely, and you can see it apply in so many other different ways. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I was struck by how Dieter kicked things off by saying that monuments all deal with both spatiality and temporality, and how all of your talks particularly focused on temporality. And then Dieter went on to talk about how monuments normally represent. But then you gave the David example with the Colossus and it having a different temporality than the other monuments you were talking about. And I was thinking about, the frequently told story of the French Revolution is that, even though it's probably apocryphal, that one of the first things the revolutionaries did was shoot all of the clocks. And Walter Benjamin took that as the instantiation of revolutionary time or messianic time, that they didn't want it to be a new Rome, but that at that moment, the revolutionary France becomes Rome. And I just wondered how that might play into the kinds of temporality you were talking about with some of your monuments.
Hey, Andrew, long time no see. Yeah, this is a terrific question. So we have basically the option of talking about discontinuity, historicity, and also have the option of choosing between the different modes of writing history that Nietzsche suggested, monumental, critical, and a museum, kind of a museum-like history. And I think what's important is that we address temporality without falling for the idea that temporality needs to mean continuity and coherence and so on and so forth. And I think, obviously, Benjamin was very much in my mind when I looked at this material, on my mind, I have to say. And the interesting thing about Benjamin is that he tries to get around this alternative between embracing continuity, tradition, and so on and so forth on the one hand, and pretending to start from the scratch and to create your own tradition that comes to the fore in certain
self-interpretations of the revolutionaries themselves, like heroism has no models. We start, we create we start a new calendar and so on and so forth. So shooting the clocks in Benjamin's case doesn't mean that we start from the scratch and forget about everything else, but that we try hard to create some kind of relation between the past and the present that is energizing or fruitful in the sense of Benjamin's revolutionary spirit. And so when he says, when he talks about messianic time, it's very much linked to this other famous quote from Benjamin, that revolutions are made by people who use the emergency brake in the train and stop the train of progress in this particular case. So this means it's not just about, creating something new, but about establishing some kind of relation to a tradition, breaking through a tradition and mobilizing material, in Benjamin's case, by this jump into the past that finds material that may be useful, so that we use this material in order to find new directions in the present. So it's very much about the more liberated relation between the present and the past than about isolating the present and forgetting about the past. So I think this is the kind of idea of temporality that comes to the fore in Benjamin. And it's certainly more linked to what Nietzsche would have called a critical relation to history.
John.
Yeah, I have a very, I have a very simple question for Peter, and I believe what the French Revolutionary did after shooting the clocks or just smashing the head of the statue in the Thomä. So I was curious about your talk of your relationship between monument and revolution and how they cannot actually get together very well with. And I'm curious about this iconographic meaning of Hercules, because Hercules just constantly appeared. And then I want you to ask, I want to ask you to elaborate a little more about that symbolic meaning of a Hercules in relation to revolution.
Well, this is an endless story, but one of the main patterns is that there was a rivalry between Hercules and somebody else in the French Revolution, as you may know. This is Hercules versus Mayan. And so it's very much a gendered conflict. Who is running the iconology of the revolution, a man or a woman? And Hercules superseded or played, kind of won over Mayan, but only after a while. So this, I think, is one of the most important aspects that come to mind when we talk about Hercules. And then, there is this intriguing intertextuality, if you will, between Hercules and other figures. I didn't talk about the Hercules-Saturn mixture in this one sketch for the memorial at the borders of France. So I think the main contemporary attributions to Hercules very much circle around the question of power and sheer physical force on the one hand, and about the imagery of enemies that come to mind, both in the sense of decadence, cleaning up, and in the sense of fighting somebody, like killing the king. But this is such a rich material, and it goes all the way through the 19th century. But maybe this.
Yes, Carl.
Well, your talk, very inspiring for me too. But I would like to oppose to this fantastic aphorism of Musil. He is a great philosopher, he's a great writer, but I think he is entirely wrong. in this sense that really monuments are defining spaces, for instance, urban spaces we live in. And we are not, these monuments are not absent. They define the way we are moving in an urban space. And I could give a lot of examples, for instance, the huge dimensions of public spaces in some capitals of the Western world or in the Soviet Union. They defined the way of moving people in urban spaces for generations. They defined how we behave, how we move. So it's a nice aphorism, but it is not true. That's the first. The second, on monumentality, I would like to you stressed in your talks mostly describing and giving interpretation, reading the monuments. And that means the continuity of monuments, how they are transformed, how they are redefining space and place. But my question is, all monuments which are going to be built and are going to be erected are based on destruction. Most monuments which have been built are on places where before these monuments have been other structures. There have been temples destroyed, there have been churches blown up, there have been palaces destroyed. And how do you integrate in the history and interpretation of monuments and monumentality the history of demolition, of destruction? Is monumentality a way of productive destruction, to use a term from economics? So could you say that interpreting monuments, you can also identify the traces of destruction, and is it a way of productive destruction, and sometimes not a productive destruction? For instance, I have some examples where just monuments are purely destructive. The plans, for instance, for the Palace of Soviets in Moscow, an example which I like very much to mention.
I would respond. That's a very interesting point. I don't know. I feel like it's on a continuum, though. I don't know that we're talking about different things, the destruction versus preservation, in the sense that, again, I'm flipping through sites that I'm thinking of the way in which they project themselves as either a replacement of something that was there before, in their own rhetoric, in their own self-presentation, versus what we know because of historical archives or archaeology, or what we know had been there. So, you know, in the late antique, a couple of the late antique examples I gave, where, so Procopius talks about Justinian destroying, I mean, he's replacing, but he's taking out what was there that had been unworthy to be used both by the populace as well as unworthy to the dedicant, the saint to whom it was dedicated. That's destruction. You know, under St. Peter's, there's a Roman cemetery that was destroyed to build St. Peter's. That's destruction, but after, you know, a generation or two after St. Peter's is built, but, you know, was that known? You know, it was certainly a surprise by the time we got to the 20th century excavations. People weren't sure what was under there. I'm being radically ahistorical in that huge time gap, but I think that the ability, I mean, you're raising a very interesting point that when you put up a monument, I mean, I would argue that it gets to write the text. It gets to write or attempts to write the story of that site. And either by claiming a lineage on that particular place, claiming a connection, constructing a sense of continuity somehow, either through text and literal cases that I was looking at, or in some origin stories that surround it, or in the performance of rituals and pilgrimage of certain events that are said to have had to have happened on that site, or things that were marked by that monument, or in the destruction of it by the monument itself is proclaiming itself to be a replacement or a reversal of what had been there before. But it still seems as though the monument it's the rhetoric of the monument to kind of try to write the script. But it also tells me that, or it would be it's my impulse to sort of try to look at what is it writing against, what is it trying to either cover up or smooth over to create a sense of either continuity or, change.
Yeah. Just very quickly, I like this idea that all monuments are, in some sense, inherently productive destruction. It reminds me of a word that you could only make in Dutch or German, which is a geschiedsuitbeelding, which means the imaging of history. So it's trying to come up with an equivalent to historiography. So imaging history as opposed to writing history. Anytime you're writing or imaging history, you're always, by implication, destroying some other narrative, right? History is myth-making. So I think every monument, to the extent that is doing geschiedsuitbeelding, or the writing or imaging of history, is destroying some other narrative you could tell about whatever it's trying to represent. And sometimes that's very specific, but sometimes it's probably not even part of the intention, but it's always part of the phenomenon.
Yeah, maybe just as you criticize Musil, I obviously have to defend him. I think that we have to distinguish between. I'm kind of reluctant to use these words, but maybe for lack of a better word, we have to distinguish between a conscious and an unconscious effect of monuments. What I mean by that is that I think Musil is really right when he says you never look at them. He's right when he says that in the urban space, they are in a strange way conspicuously unconspicuous, as he put it, or inconspicuous. So this is actually true when you ask people, who is this guy? I think many people would just would just have no clue. And even when they pass by this monument over and over again. This is one side, but I think you're perfectly right that by claiming that there is this kind of formative effect a space, a monument, and so on has in a more general sense, unconscious or however you would call it, namely in the sense that, for instance, it creates a certain general attitude of or pattern of hierarchy. So they are the big guys. Who they are, I don't know, but they are the big guys. And this is, I think, a more general and much less, hermeneutically rich function that, and in this sense, Musil is certainly wrong. I mean, they have this obtrusiveness.
We have one more question from Nicholas. Yeah. You get the last question.
Thank you very much for all your talks. I wanted to provide you with an example and maybe ask you a question about it that could link Morgan's argument about intermediality and all your arguments about spatiality and temporality, which is Maximilian's triumph in the 16th century, which was a huge project aimed at building a triumph of the emperor in print, but a print that could be built in several different palaces and in a sense would be ephemeral, but at the same time long-lasting because it could be reproduced.
This was a very monumental project. It was huge. It was like 54 meters long. It was supposed to be displayed in different palaces. It involved the activity of several of the most important painters of the court, including Burgmeier and others. And at the same time, it attempted to celebrate the emperor and connect him with the past and the imperial past and the imperial present. So my question is twofold. First, if you can think of any other similar examples to this, which I can't, and if maybe this could be an example in which temporality, spatiality, because these were meant to be installed in palaces, etc., and intermediality could all be involved in one case.
Well, I'll just say I actually think that even though both the Maximilian's monumental triumphal arch and the serial prints of the triumph itself, which of course have precedence with Mantegna and earlier Italian Renaissance prints, they're never on that quite that scale, were quite novel in the moment, but became actually a very standard practice in early modern Europe. And I think prints are actually one of the most overlooked cases of monumental production in the early modern period, because they allowed for the possibility, as you say, of circulation, and monumental claims and monumentality made through colonizing multiple places at once and multiple audiences. Certainly in the Dutch context, and the Dutch in the 17th century had really developed the first modern news media, in addition to, capitalizing on the printing press for all sorts of things. You absolutely see that rather than worrying about even making plans to build something that doesn't get built, they just make it in print. And prints can do things that stone or sculpture and architecture couldn't do. So that's an interesting case, I think, of monumental experiment, sort of trying to deal with the issues of permanence and avoiding ruin by making something that's ephemeral to begin with, but can do something that any one static monument cannot.
Yeah, I was thinking, especially as I saw the medal that you showed, that this is another aspect of monumentality, which we don't see in the monuments themselves. If we're looking just at the monuments, or even the way the monuments themselves are just talked about or described, but even in the Roman period, the circulation with coins, not to mention the texts and kind of the narratives or biographies of emperors, particularly, but also features in widespread in history texts. But the use of commemorative coins as a way of untethering monumentality from a place, and from, you don't need to have seen a building that's represented on a coin. Now, it's not as common as we might think, the representation of buildings on coins, but it is a phenomenon that many emperors, and it does predate imperial coinage as well, that are using as part of their own image making to stress, because one's work as a patron is so heavily, it's such strong currency in the Roman social political world of being a euergetistic, sort of somebody who is contributing to the community, especially one of the ways is through construction projects, things that are going to help the city. And that heralding of that through the kind of icon of a building creates the building as a monument, whether or not it's ever even seen, or for populations who never saw it. So you can have subjects of the Roman Empire who have images of Roman buildings on their coins that are completely foreign to them in terms of a face-to-face experience, and yet that ideal of monumentality it's not just circulated, it's really constructed through this other completely different kind of medium. Yeah.
Super. So please thank our speakers again, and we have time for lunch.